Welcome everybody to our second session of the Science of Wine. And we will have 4 presenters today, and we will, after the presentations, we will divide up into 4 breakout rooms, and you will all have the ability to choose your room and move back and forth. For each, I will go over those technical details at the time. Well, with that, let's start the show.
But before we begin, I just want to thank the great team that we have here for all their excellent contributions to the graphics and to the content of this session. There's Rick Shepro, Educateurs at Chicago, Matthew Raphaelson, and Raj Dev, Educateurs in San Francisco, and yours truly in San Francisco. Okay, next slide, please. So what gives wine its flavors and aromas? A wide range, it turns out, of chemical compounds. There are over 800 to 1,000 different flavor active compounds that arise at different stages in the winemaking process. These are measurable by sensitive chemical tests in the laboratory, but only a very limited number of them lie above the human threshold of perception, which is something that varies actually between tasters. Even those substances lying below or well below the threshold of detection, that is, they can't be tasted or smelled by human beings, they can still play a role by either masking or boosting other compounds. Now, when I mention this multitude of chemical substances, I can easily imagine many of the listeners now rolling their eyes, anticipating an onslaught of unpronounceable names. Next slide, please. Indeed, from Alice Waters' book, We Are What We Eat, a Slow Food Manifesto, she comments on fast food culture and artificial ingredients, such as the preservatives amyl acetate and benzyl isobutyrate. As a general rule, she says, I feel that if you can't pronounce the words of the substances you're eating, it should give you pause. But it turns out that many natural ingredients have equally unpronounceable names. For example, the omega-3 eicosapentaenoic acid present in eggs. So it goes with wine. When we go shopping at a grocery store, we don't demand a list of chemical compounds found in bananas. But since we seek to be educated about wine, especially Bordeaux, we examine not only the effects of terroir and climate and so on, but also the chemical makeup of our favorite beverage. And so we'll try to make it palatable, if you will. Next slide, please. This is a quote from Jamie Goode, chapter 9. The taste of a wine is a property of the taster, but one that is based on the chemical composition of the wine. An analogy might be, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to see or hear it, has it really fallen? The flavor of wine, you see, doesn't really exist on its own as an intrinsic thing without any interaction between the taster and the basic elements of the wine. In the sections that follow, Raj Dev and Matthew Raphaelson will illuminate the major chemical compounds, making them palatable, and connect them to the wide range of flavors that tasters can pick up. Then Rick Shepro will show what happens to these flavors at the final destination, as well as the variations between tasters and so-called super tasters. Okay, Raj and Matthew, take it from there.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Chee. Thanks for the introduction. And so I want to start out by saying that I am going to start by giving some chemicals, but I'm going to focus on what those chemicals give you the sense of. There are a whole host of chemicals that go into the concept of strawberry, for example, but there may be a few chemicals in wine that give you the perception of strawberry, but the focus is on the fact that there is the perception of strawberry and there is some chemical basis, and you need not be too worried if you see a chemical name around that. So we're here in the vineyard, and in the vineyard, right in the grapes is where you'll start to get the flavor of black currant from the skins of the grape. And then you'll also get in Cabernet Sauvignon and actually all of the Cabernet family, the Sauvignon Blanc for the reds, Merlot, Malbec to a lesser extent, Cabernet Franc. You'll get green bell pepper. Petrichor. Petrichor is the smell of rain on rocks, sometimes associated with minerality, and we talked about this earlier. And that petrichor note will not come from the grapes, but will come from the vineyard, and will either splash onto the grapes or somehow find its way into the vat. But that comes from the vineyard. And what I'm doing here is first focusing on all of the notes that come from outside of the winery. So in the field, whether they be the grape or somewhere else in the field. So petrichor is not in the grapes, but it's in the field. And then rose and violets. So beta-ionone is the chemical, but the scent of rose and violet comes from the grapes in the field. Now, as I said, and as Chee said, there are chemicals associated with these notes, but they shouldn't scare you. So for example, there's a thiol by the name of mercaptomethylpentanone, but that complicated sounding chemical is associated with blackcurrant. And when people talk about pyrazines or methoxypyrazines, this is an example of a pyrazine, the note of green bell pepper. Also, geosmin is a compound. It's technically a sesquiterpene, and that is the compound that's associated with rain on wet stones. And beta-ionone is the chemical associated with rose and violets. So now we'll move from the vineyard into the winery. And the grape juice that's unfermented will start to macerate, and that maceration process will extract lots of anthocyanins and flavors and tannins. And during that process, the yeast will start to consume the sugar and will produce carbon dioxide, will produce alcohol, and will produce some heat. And also a host of flavor compounds as well. For example, in addition to the alcohol and carbon dioxide, the yeast will produce isoamyl acetate, which will give you the note of bananas and pears. And again, I'm focusing less on the chemistry, but the fact that bananas and pears come from this often called the secondary phase, and therefore secondary aromas, the fermentation process. Amyl alcohol gives this note of almond paste, marzipan. Again, this is one of the products of yeast fermentation. Then Parmesan cheese. There's a cheesy note that comes from the yeast breaking down the amino acids. All of these come from the fermentation process. So just to recap, we've gone from the vineyard, and now we've gone to the fermentation process, and we can see that there is an accumulation of notes that are coming from all of these processes that end up in wine. So after the maceration and the fermentation, this liquid is pressed and it's sent down into a vat. And for fine red wines, it's often piped into an oak barrel. And often it's a small oak barrel, and that oak barrel will add its own notes. But before, for most red wines, there's the process of malolactic fermentation. And so we'll have the malolactic bacteria, the lactobacter, that will start to transform malic acid, apple acid, into a smoother lactic acid. And lactic acid is the softer, smoother acid that you'll get from kefir, from yogurt, even from milk. That's the softer acidity. And so as a result of that softening of the acidity, the pH gets lifted. And also an important byproduct of the malolactic fermentation is diacetyl. And diacetyl is that popcorn butter note. And that combination of milky acid plus popcorn butter note, also with the fermentation product of isovaleric acid, that cheese note, that's where you get those buttery, cheesy, milky notes in wine. So now we've gone from field to fermentation to the malolactic fermentation, and we'll continue. It's in that barrel, spends many months in a process called elevage. It's literally raising the wine, rearing the wine up. And during this process, the wine interacts with oxygen, microoxygenation. And the process of interacting with the oxygen, as well as interacting with the inside of the toasted barrels, gives another set of chemicals, coconuts from lactones, also guaiacols and furfurins. These chemicals will give the notes of smoke and chocolate and coffee and wheat bran. That pile of what looks like sawdust is actually a pile of wheat bran, that kind of roasted, almost like a deep caramelly aroma. That's the furfuryls that are coming from the inside of the barrel, giving you the sense of fullness and caramel notes. So now we're going to go to the next stage of winemaking, which is where that liquid gets put into bottles. And here we have Croix Canon. Now with elevage and the notes that come from the bottle, we're at the tertiary phase. And the tertiary phase involves the tertiary aromas. And these are the aromas that'll typically come from bottle age. Maple syrup, and the chemical is called sotalon. And then fenugreek in a different concentration, you'll get that note from the same chemical. Cedar box, sometimes they'll use the note cigar box. Again, that's the cedar note, because cigar boxes are made from cedar. And the combination of that with a tobacco note leads people to give the note of cigar box. And also ginger comes from a compound called zingerone. And all of these compounds that produce these notes come from bottle age. This is just a quick overview, just a sample of notes and how they creep into a glass of wine when you sniff them during the entire process, going from the field to fermentation to malolactic fermentation to the elevage, and then finally in the cellar with bottle age. And Matthew, I'll leave this to you.
All right. Okay. And so my role here is to kind of present you with the timeline, or as I say, an unfolding of a sip. And this is to illustrate how we interact with the science of wine that and the chemicals that Raj has just described, and perceive flavor. And so first, we start with our visual receptors. We see the wine. We note the color. Is it red or white? How deep is the color? Are there signs of age? As those of you who read the Jamie Goode book, we know that color is deeply important to many winemakers. One even said, quote, "These days, everyone wants to make more powerful and impressive wines. So whole bunch is an unfashionable move because your wine looks weaker. For many people, color is an important property of the wine." That was by the great South African winemaker, Eben Sadie. And clearly, many winemakers believe that when you see deep color, it will affect how you perceive the flavor of the wine. Interestingly, there are some studies out there that suggest when we do truly blind tasting, where the wine is served in black glasses and the tasters are blindfolded so they cannot see the wine, that even experienced tasters cannot always differentiate between red or white wines. That's how important our visual receptors are. Okay, the next thing we typically do is smell the wine. We invoke our olfactory receptors. And when you're smelling through your nose, we call that orthonasal. There are thousands of different aroma receptors in our noses. Efforts to organize them, to collapse them into a manageable number of clusters or categories have not met with much consensus. Perceiving aroma is so complicated. If you thought visual beauty is in the eye of the beholder, the complexity and individuality of aroma receptors prompted this week's economist to coin the phrase olfactory bulb of the beholder. An important point here is that the chemical compounds must be in vapor form in order for us to smell them. And by the way, this is what's meant when you see the word volatility, such as volatile acidity. That means the compounds are in their vapor form and you can smell them. Okay, now we take our first sip and we invoke the touch and taste receptors on our tongue and in our mouth. Now, unlike the olfactory receptors, there are 5 physical taste receptors on the tongue, and many argue a 6th. We have sweet, we have sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And now there's a consensus building that there's a 6th called calcium. And there may be more, but this is where the consensus today is. In addition, inside the mouth, there are touch receptors. That's how you sense hot or cold, astringency, or even pain, if you bite your tongue. Now, in the mouth, the chemical compounds must be in their liquid form to be tasted. And there, of course, is an interaction between the taste and touch receptors. We all know the impact on taste when wine is served too cold or too warm. Now we swallow and exhale, and we bring into play our second set of olfactory receptors called retronasal olfaction. And this is when the vapors are breathed back over the mouth and nose receptors. The addition of heat from inside our mouth and nasal cavity release and intensify aromas. And the retronasal olfaction can really help us perceive the finish, the sensation of a lengthened finish. And that's a technique that many tasters do, is to, after you've swallowed the wine, then you exhale, and those aromas come back into play, and you get the sensation of a lengthened finish. Then I want to come back to your head, because there's a whole aspect of this that's inside your head, other factors that can affect perception. Your prior knowledge and past experience can certainly influence how you think about a wine. And then additional, what we call in behavioral psychology of priming, cues given to you by the label or the shape of the bottle can influence how you're going to feel about the wine, or what Robert Parker says you'll taste and smell can have a big influence on what you actually taste and smell. So the perceptions from all these receptors, and also what's in your head and what you've recently read, combine for each individual in individualistic ways to create impressions of flavor, which brings us to our next speaker, Rick Shepro.
So the question we want to move to now is, when 2 or 3 people taste the same wine and describe it differently, why is that? Is it because they have a different vocabulary about wine? Or is it because they have different past experiences with wine and have different knowledge, different expectations, different personal preferences? Or are they actually tasting differently because of individual physiological differences? We're used to there being a bell curve distribution of people's height and weight and other attributes. I think a useful analogy to wine tasting about individual differences is the area of vision. But with vision, you can give a vision test. You can see how well you can read letters. But visual perception's more than just reading letters. So there is an illiterate eye chart seen on the right for people who can't read, children, young children, where a person just moves their hand in the direction that the E is pointing, and it's used in a similar way. There are other eye charts that display different aspects of vision, several of them designed by Dennis Pelley at New York University. Some of these, like the contrast sensitivity, show not how well you can see different size letters, but how well you can see letters that have high contrast or low contrast around them. Or there's the letters in noise chart, which sees how easily you can see a letter even when it's surrounded by distracting shapes. There are ambiguous images that people like to talk about and play with. If you look more toward the left of this picture, it will look like a duck. If you look more toward the right, it looks like a rabbit, and the duck's bill becomes ears. But that's not the kind of difference. Most people see it that both ways. That ambiguity is not what we're talking about when we mean individual differences. I was surprised at an art museum, the National Gallery in London, once drinking in a painting by Titian that I love about Bacchus and Ariadne. My friend, who I knew to be red-green colorblind, had just a very different perception of what this painting was all about. And it had to do really with my being captivated by this garment that surrounding Bacchus in Titian red. That's the focus of the painting for me. He was seeing a different painting, talking about different details in the painting, and there are a lot. But for me, none of them come close to having the impact of the figure of Bacchus and his robe. In 2015, thanks to this image of a dress that went viral, many people insisted vehemently that this dress was black with blue stripes, but other people saw white and gold. And we began to get used to the idea that color perception can be a lot more varied from person to person and more complex than we might have thought. For taste and smell, the most obvious place to look for individual differences would to inspect those taste receptors at the top of the interior of the nose and on the tongue that Matthew showed. But that's not how the science in this area developed. Instead, it had to do with noticing that different people had very different reactions to some very specific bitter substances, and then discovering genetic associations. In an event that's famous among flavor and taste scientists now, in 1931, a chemist at DuPont named Arthur Fox synthesized a chemical, phenylthiocarbamide, and found it was tasteless to him, but it was extremely bitter to a colleague. And this led to a lot of scientific studies. In the 1960s, a new chemical, propylthiouracil, that's called PROP by taste scientists and PTU by pharmacists, became known with similar properties. And in the 1980s, the psychophysicist Linda Bartoshuk, then at Yale, started using the term super taster to describe people who found prop to taste extraordinarily bitter. She found about a quarter of people in most samples found it extraordinarily bitter. She called those super tasters. Non-tasters were about 25% who didn't think it tasted like anything. And then about half of people tasted the bitterness, but they didn't find it extreme, and they were called medium tasters. Now, with genetic testing, this super taster phenomenon entered a new era, and it's now very well established that the ability to taste propylthiouracil is attributable to the genetic encoding in a quite specific gene in a quite specific taste receptor. So it's unfortunate that the term super taster has come about. It's caused a lot of confusion. But more important, this substance is not found in foods. And now other genes have been found to affect how strongly people taste other bitter flavors. Anosmias are the inability to taste either completely or particular things. The non-tasters have an anosmia to propylthiouracil. They may have anosmias to Brussels sprouts and not taste any bitterness there, but it becomes more complicated. Brettanomyces is a smell that some people are very sensitive to in wine. It's an appreciated sense. People call it gamey, wet dog. A lot of people used to think it was the taste of true terroir. Now it's known to be caused by a particular fungus yeast. Some people are very sensitive to it, others are not, and it's not clear why. Research in that is pretty indecisive. Beta-ionone, the violet floral scent, a quarter of people appear to be genetically anosmic to that, but it's an important smell in wine. And so they're like my colorblind friend. They see very well, but they may smell very well, but this is a smell that is just absent for them. Cork taint, 2,4,6 trichloroanisole, called TCA. That's been shown to have a huge variation from person to person in whether they can smell it or not. An unusual one is rotundone, which has been discovered to be the cause of the peppery smell in Syrah, but it's the scent of pepper. It's not the the taste of pepper on your tongue. And 20% of people can't taste that at all. That's been shown to be genetic. Most people can detect it at minuscule concentrations in wine or in water solutions, 8 nanograms per liter, for example. But 20% of people can't detect it at even 4,000 nanograms per liter. If we think back about Matthew's chart, and you saw that where the nasal receptors are, they're up high. They can be accessed either through the nose or through the mouth. And that gets us to the orthonasal sense that you get through your nose when from sipping wine, from smelling wine. In the glass, you're smelling wine. Retronasally, you're smelling wine mixed with saliva. None of us have ever actually tasted wine because you can only taste wine mixed with the saliva that's in your mouth. Of course, that's true with all foods, that they're always mixed with saliva. It can have a significant effect retronasally on what you can smell. Raj started talking about some of that. In your glass, you have substances that lock up the aromas of certain smells, and so you won't smell those when you're smelling it in the glass. But when it's mixed with saliva on the right, we're not suggesting that you spit into your glass, but when you have the wine in your mouth, these substances unlock some of the smells. These are beta-glucosidases, and as an enzyme, they release the smells. It's a very interesting thing. The other thing that is happening with saliva is that the saliva proteins bind with tannin. And they do two things. They cause proteins to clump up and come out of solution and precipitate. They also affect how the tannins taste and smell, because tannins do have some smell. It's mostly taste. But we now know that there are dozens of different kinds of tannin in wine, and they react differently to different properties of saliva. People produce saliva in very different amounts, but they also produce saliva that's just different levels of pH. Dentists know a lot about the effects of different kinds of pH and other attributes with saliva. You can't study a Vermeer while you're in an MRI, but you can taste wine. And various studies in France and the US comparing the brain activation of experts, variously defined, when sampling wine compared to control groups of non-experts. There are brain activation studies in other fields showing, for example, that classical music connoisseurs' brains become active in different ways and at different moments than a control group, with some intriguing results, including that the connoisseurs show activation in their brains just before musical climaxes, suggesting that anticipation itself is an important aspect of connoisseurship in brain activity. And the same thing appears to happen with wine. So what would I suggest for you in tasting wine with other people who may literally, because of their individual differences, be tasting a different wine? For that, and in conclusion, I'd like to go back just quickly to a book written before these fascinating new studies. Evelyn Waugh's 1945 novel, Brideshead Revisited, The Sacred and Profane Memories of Captain Charles Ryder. In that book, Charles Ryder, hosted by his Oxford classmate Sebastian at the stately home of Brideshead, discovers that the butler is worried. The cellar is not being replaced properly by the Lord. That's how we get low, the butler says. There's enough here for 10 years, but how shall we be then? And then Ryder, the narrator, says, it was during those tranquil evenings with Sebastian that I first made a serious acquaintance with wine and sowed the seed of that rich harvest which was to be my stay in many barren years. We would sit, he and I, in the painted parlor with 3 bottles open on the table and 3 glasses before each of us. Sebastian had found a book on wine tasting, and we followed its instruction in detail. We warmed the glass slightly, filled 1/3 of it, swirled the wine around, nursed it in our hands, held it to the light, breathed it in, sipped it, filled our mouths with it, and rolled it over the tongue, ringing it on the palate like a coin on the counter, tilted our heads back and let it trickle down the throat. Then we talked of it and nibbled Bath Oliver biscuits and passed on to another wine, then back to the first, then on to another, until all 3 were in circulation and the order of glasses got confused and we fell out over which was which, and we passed the glasses to and fro until there were 6 glasses, some of them with mixed wines in them, which we'd filled from the wrong bottle, till we were obliged to start again with 3 clean glasses each, and the bottles were empty and our praise of them wilder and more exotic. It's a little shy wine like a gazelle, like a leprechaun, dappled in a tapestry meadow, like a flute by still water. And this is a wise old wine, a prophet in a cave. And we would leave the golden candlelight of the dining room for the starlight outside and sit on the edge of the fountain, listening to the splash and gurgle over the rocks. And now Chee will bring us back to earth.
Okay, so thanks so much, guys. That was an amazing presentation. Fantastic job. And so, as you can all see, and as Jamie Good himself says, there can be no platonic ideal for what constitutes the best wine, quote unquote, best wine. Anyone who knows me knows that typicity is paramount to me. The best, to me, it means most typical for its place of origin. But for most consumers, the best is simply the wine they like the most. And in the end, it's that preference, influenced to a degree by genetics, that drives sales. Should the market then respond to genetics the way the market has overwhelmingly to wine critics' scores? There's a similar but far more justifiable process in my field of medicine, where patients' genomes can be used to predict which medication is most likely to help while causing the fewest side effects. That's useful. But if gene sequences predict which flavor compounds will appeal the most to certain segments of the population, segmented by their gene sequences, should marketing or even winemaking itself be guided by consumers' gene profiles? Theoretically possible. That would seem to, however, ignore the more fascinating aspects of wine, such as terroir, minerality, which we talked about last time, or the vigneron's philosophy of wine, more poetic things. And of course, the accumulated experience of tasters over time. For me, such a practice would also mean the sacrifice of wine typicity for what one might call fast wine culture, what Alice Waters might call fast wine culture, marked by convenience and reliability of sales above all. And that would certainly be a modern but dystopian wine world, and hopefully it's a long way off. And now we will divide into our breakout rooms and then regather for a general discussion. That will be open-ended, so stay as long as you like. If I don't see you there, I want to thank everyone once again for the interest that you've shown in the Commanderie de Bordeaux and its Educateurs sessions on the science of wine.
I would just like to thank today's presenters. I thought this was really an excellent program.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of work went into the preparation of each commentary, and I thank you all for a wonderful job.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I'm actually going to watch it again on the videotape version. So good.
Yeah, give me a week to get it edited down.
Yeah, it's fine. Take your time. Raj,
What's
this
that?
is Eric, I had a quick question. When you were
Sure.
describing the process flow of fermentation and through to bottling, at one point you talked about secondary fermentation.
Yes.
Was that this developing secondary? Well, explain to me what you're talking about.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, if I did, I should have been clear, because there are two aspects. One is that the wine world, for some reason, I find this confusing, classifies secondary aromas as the aromas that are produced in the fermentation process, and they're called secondary. Now, to make this complicated, there is a secondary fermentation, which is the malolactic fermentation. It's a higher temperature fermentation,
Right.
in another vessel, and there is yet another group of flavor compounds, aroma compounds that are produced there, in addition to diacetyl, which is a byproduct of moving from transforming the malic to lactic acid. I didn't mention this. This is just like the surface level. There are lots of other compounds that are produced in addition to the diacetyl. And so that is from the secondary fermentation, and all of that is one part of the secondary aromas.
Got it.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
A big distinction is that the secondary fermentation is a bacterial fermentation.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas primary is a yeast fermentation, what we're all familiar with. But it's the
That's right.
bacteria that go on from malic to lactic. In fact, in the course of working on this, we discussed the formation of vinegar, acetic acid, and that is
Yeah.
also a bacterial process with
That's
acetobacter
right.
converting ethanol to
Yeah.
to vinegar.
Yeah.
So
And
And then, of course, there's the third form of fermentation, the carbonic, which is enzymes, right? The whole different process.
that is true. There's no other living vector involved, but just the alcohol dehydrogenase that works without any oxygen. Yeah, Chee, you were talking about lactobacter and then acetobacter, and what's interesting is, just like with yeast, there are different kinds of yeast, and they all have their own set of secondary compounds that are produced as a result. The same with lactobacter. That they'll all produce diacetyl, but I said there are those other things that are produced, and they vary quite significantly depending on the strain of lactobacter or acetobacter that is used.
Great, thanks. And I'm proud to see that we still have 15 wine geeks here.
By the way, Eric, or whoever, if you do get to Lynchbosch, you can go, when you go down, you go into the barrel room. There is a parallel room for the mallow fermentation,
Oh, wow.
and it's just a ordinary room, because I think the temperature is different in there, but they don't put all of the wine through mallow, only a portion. I don't
Really?
know what the proportion is, but it's not 100%. It's maybe 25% or something like that of the wine in barrels. It goes through the malolactic fermentation in barrel in a separate room.
We'll get to the bottom of it. It's probably a warmer temperature, right?
I think I heard somebody say that the temperature is different
I think it's
for
warmer.
mallow.
Yeah, Raj said that, I believe.
Yeah, it's a higher temperature. Right.
Right, and so it is, for that reason, there is a separate room
Yeah,
for the mallow.
great, terrific. Well, I'm going to
Yeah.
start drinking heavily, so thanks, guys. See you soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
I've got to start making dinner.
Okay, yes,
Bye-bye.
thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you.